are in the late spring series called Glory Days. And last week we were able to celebrate mothers as a part of that series. And today, as has already been mentioned, we're going to be celebrating some graduates who are in, I think, some of their glory days, and God has much more in store for them as well. And I think part of what's going on in their lives, and the same thing is going on in our lives to some degree, is this term called narrative construction. Anybody ever heard that term before? Are you familiar with what it means when you talk about narrative construction? Okay, well, let me break it down. Narrative simply means story. Okay, and in construction, obviously, means to build. And so, therefore, narrative construction is simply the building of a story. Great writers carefully construct their stories to make sure that characters are developed with certain events that are strategically placed inside the storyline. Because what they want to do is they want the audience to identify with the characters in some way and to track until they get to the finale, until they get to the end of the story. I think John Grisham is a great writer, okay? I've listened to some of his books, read a couple of them, and you know what? He has a perfect way of constructing and weaving bits of information about characters into events. And usually what happens in a Grisham novel is what? There's a surprise at the end, okay? But he does it so masterfully. Anybody here Grisham fans? Anybody like reading his stuff? Okay, yeah, I think he's just a master. But you know what? You don't have to be a professional writer to be able to construct a narrative. In fact, a lot of people do it every single day, and we don't get paid $1, okay, for the stories that we're writing. In fact, have you ever heard a person say this? I know God has a plan for my life. I just don't know what it is. Ever heard somebody say that? I just had a friend of mine call me this week and tell me about a very unfortunate event that took place in her life. And she said almost those exact words. Now, she's a strong believer. She's a follower of Christ. And so her mindset is this: I don't know what God's doing, but I know that it's going to be for my good. That's narrative construction. To some extent, we all do that. Whether we realize it or not, there are some who are very aware of everything that goes on in their life, and they analyze every bit and piece of information to try to help them construct what they think God is doing in their life. And there are other people who just live every day, okay? They don't think about it. They just go from day to day and just move on. Here's my goal that I want to share with you today. My goal is to encourage all of us, whether we're those deeply introspective people or we just roll with it, okay, if we're that type of person. What I want to do today is to challenge you to look for certain events in your life that reassure you that there is a big reveal. There is a grand finale to our life story. And I guarantee you, it involves glory. What I want to do today is to look at two events in Jesus' life while he was here on earth, because I think they provided narrative construction for his life, for us to understand it, but I also think there are things from his life that we then can apply to our own lives as well. And you know what? The first event takes place on a mountain. We don't know which mountain. We just kind of assume that it's someplace near what the ancient city of Caesarea Philippi. And you know the story. It's found in Matthew chapter 17, so I invite you to look at that with me this morning. And then we're going to add some more details after we read Matthew's account as well. Here's the story as Matthew provides it for us. He says, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up to a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. And Peter exclaimed, Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." The disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over to them and touched them and said, "Get up, don't be afraid." And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah was gone, and they saw only Jesus. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." You know, Luke is the only other gospel writer that provides this account of this event in Jesus' life. And I'm glad he did, because he adds some details that Matthew doesn't include for us. So I'm going to invite you to jump over to Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, verse 28. I'm going to read Luke's version because he fills in some of the gaps. He says, about 8 days later, Jesus took Peter, John, and James up on a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared and began talking with Jesus. They were glorious to see. And they were speaking about his exodus from this world, which was about to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. Peter and the others had fallen asleep. When they woke up, they saw Jesus' glory and the 2 men standing with him. Did you catch the details that Luke gives us that Matthew didn't? For instance, in verse 28, the reason why Jesus went up on this high mountain and he took these 3 guys with him, what was he doing? He went there to pray. Jesus did that quite a bit. That wouldn't have been anything outstanding. That was pretty ordinary. This time, he took Peter, James, and John with him. Verse 31 says that Moses and Elijah's appearance was glorious. And he also tells us what these two guys who had been dead for a long, long time, who now were back talking with Jesus, Luke tells us what they were talking about. Luke tells us they were talking about Jesus' exodus from this world, referring to his upcoming death and resurrection, okay? That's exactly what that term means. In verse 32, it says that Peter and James and John were asleep, which means this happened at night. This didn't happen in the daytime. This happened at night, which would have been even more spectacular if you think about what they saw and what they experienced. All things considered, I think it's safe to say that this would have been one of Jesus' glory days here on earth. Now, granted, having angels sing and everything when you're born, that's pretty glorious. Changing water into wine in Canaan, that's pretty glorious. But you know what? In this instance, on this day, Jesus was glorified. His presence was transformed. And again, as we talked about the first week, we're trying to describe something that's beyond human experience, okay? Beyond human explanation. What we do is we try to choose some metaphors. We try to choose some words to help us describe. So it says, his face was as the sun, okay, bright. His clothing were brilliant white. And again, think, this was at night. How spectacular would that have been? Again, imagine if you were one of these 3 guys and you had fallen asleep and all of a sudden you were awoken. What would you have thought? This is a dream or this is a nightmare? What would it have been? How long would it have taken you to realize what was really going on? Maybe, just maybe, that's why Elijah and Moses was there, to try to help set the context so that you wouldn't think, hey, this is just something really, really crazy. You know what I really, really wish? John was there. The author of the book of John was there. I wish he would have told us about this experience. He's pretty good at writing about glorious things, is he not? I mean, look at the book of Revelation. He did a pretty good job. using some terms and some things that we could understand there. I wish he had told us what this event was like in his own words, but he didn't. I love, though, that Luke talked about Jesus' exodus, said that they were talking about Jesus' exodus. Catch that tie-in to Moses? Moses is the one who led the Israelites out of captivity, and that was the first exodus. So why Elijah? Elijah was the prophet who set up the prophecies about his coming Messiah and helped people understand what it would look like. You know what? It almost seems to me, at least, that Jesus needed some encouragement from these two guys who had been dead for a long time, but who now are with God. He needed the encouragement of them coming back in a glorified state to help him finish his mission here on earth. Jesus knew all along that he would die on the cross, but you have to keep in mind his divinity was equal to his humanity. Let me say that again. His divinity was equal to his humanity. And maybe at this point, what Jesus the human needed was some encouragement. You know, if we are focusing on the glory as just being in God's presence, this story highlights that even more. Because what happens that is so glorious here? Not only is Jesus transformed in his appearance, and he's with Elijah and Moses, but something else happens that only happened one other time while Jesus was here on earth. Do you remember what it was? God's audible voice spoke so that other people could hear it. When was the only other time that happened? Jesus' baptism. But there was no cloud there. There was no fire. That voice just came down from heaven. But in this particular case, just like in the Old Testament that we looked at, there was this cloud. And from this cloud, we are told that God spoke. Man, that's his presence. And that's glory. God's glory was on full display. He was with his Son, and it was experienced in a way that this trio of humans could experience it and never forget it. So here's the point that I want us to take away from this particular story that we're looking at today, okay? It happened at a very critical time in Jesus' ministry. The cross was just right around the corner for Jesus. And Jesus needed some assurance. One of the things he needed assurance was that his Father had not forsaken him, that God himself had not left him. That would come later, would it not? When God had to turn his head to allow Jesus to die, to fulfill his mission. So what Jesus needed right now, at this point in his ministry, was for glory to show up. He needed his Father to show up, and he did. When it comes to narrative construction, this tells us a lot about Jesus' character. Because in the story, Jesus is described by his Father as, "This is my Son." And we see human parts of Jesus in this particular event that we don't see in other places. Add to that, these three guys got to see it. They couldn't talk about it until they got off the mountain, but these got to see it. Until they got, after the resurrection, they got to see it because it was so critical that at this point in time, if these three people could not be fully convinced that Jesus was God, you know what? That ministry would have been really hard to fulfill. So that was Jesus' first glory day that I want to look at today. It took place on a mountain. The second one that I want to look at this time takes place in a cemetery. Kind of an odd place. But turn with me to John chapter 11. It's a story about where Jesus raises his friend Lazarus from the dead, and he says he did this for a very specific reason. Now, you know what that reason is. I'm going to read it again just to refresh your memory, but you know what? If you have not read John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44 recently, I invite you to do that this afternoon. Okay? I don't have time to read all of it for you this morning. I'm just going to pick out some highlights of these verses that highlight the glory that took place that day. John chapter 11, verse 1 says this. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. We remember that story from a few weeks ago. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened. Why? For the glory of God, and so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. You know, Jesus was very close friends with these guys. They knew him probably better than anyone else, and they believed that he was who he said that he was. And so they sent him a message saying, hey, you know what? Your friend is sick. Why don't you come and take care of him? Inherent in this was that Jesus could do what he said he could do. But Jesus saw this having more potential than just healing another man. He saw it as a potential for glory. He knew people would now believe in him more. He also knew that this would help him in his ministry as he continued on. He said it this way, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Jesus knew that in addition to just people knowing more about him, they would give some credit and praise to God for what they were going to experience. Because you know what? We've talked about this before too. When we experience God's glory, what do? We give him glory. We just add to that glory. I think raising someone from the dead is greater than changing water into wine, don't you? I think raising someone from the dead is different than casting out demons or healing any other ailment that people may have. Because what can happen? If you heal somebody, if you change water into wine, somebody could say, oh, that's just fake. Somehow, some way, he faked that. But man, if you've got a guy that everybody knows is dead, and you see him come back to life, that's hard to refute, is it not? That's hard to say, no, this is just fake. Everybody knew Lazarus had been in that tomb for 4 days. And yet, Jesus raised him from the dead. John chapter 11, verse 11 says this. Jesus said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was just simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. So when Jesus moves towards Bethany, word gets out to Mary and Martha that Jesus is just outside of town. So this time Mary stays home and Martha runs out to greet him, which is opposite of what it usually is. Martha runs out to greet him, and she begins with a statement of faith about her faith in Jesus when she says this, my brother wouldn't have died had you been here, Jesus. See, she knew that Jesus was capable of doing something that nobody else could do. And I think verses 23 through 27 helps us understand even how Jesus had to teach Martha at that moment about a topic that she was going to experience not only in the next few hours, but in the next few weeks. And that topic is resurrection. How does a dead man come back to life? Martha understood that yeah, there would be a resurrection at the last days, but she didn't get the idea that resurrection could happen with Jesus in the present time. Here's how this conversation went between her and Jesus. Verse 24. Yes, Martha, said, "He will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." And Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this, Martha? "Well, yes, Lord." She told him, "I've always believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, and that you are the one who came into this world from God." That is a strong statement. You see, Martha knew that she saw God when she looked at Jesus. She just didn't understand how her dead brother, and in a few weeks a dead Jesus, could walk out of their tombs. So Jesus showed her and showed everybody else there what resurrection looks like. Before we talk about that event, though, I want to back up because there's part of this story that I bet you missed as many times as I had. And I want to make sure we don't miss it today because it shows us a part of Jesus' humanity that oftentimes we miss. And part of the reason is because it's how the original language of the Bible is translated into English. I want you to look down at verses 33 in the English Standard Version again. Okay, I've been reading from the New Living Translation. I want you to look at how the English Standard Version translates beginning in verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they told him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could he who opened the eyes of blind men also have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb, and it was a cave, and a stone lay against it. You know, when we read that passage, what do we look at? We look at verse 35, do we not? The shortest verse in the Bible. And we talk about Jesus' humanity and the fact that he had emotion and he wept. We talk about Jesus shedding tears. But you know what? I think other translations give us a much better picture of what was going on inside of Jesus. And I want to read to you what the New Living Translation has to say about verses 33 and 38, and notice the difference. John 11:33 in the New Living Translation says, "When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was greatly troubled." Verse 38, Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Here's a very interesting point. In the original language of the New Testament, when it talks about Jesus being moved, it's the same Greek word that's used outside of the Bible to describe when a horse does this. Listen. That's what Jesus did. That's what Jesus was feeling. Emotionally, yeah, he was moved to tears, but there was also anger in Jesus because he was feeling so much frustration with what was going on that he was upset that sometimes he snorts just like we do when we're upset. Of course, that leads to the question, why was Jesus mad? What made him mad about this whole situation? Let's do some process of elimination. Can we do that? He wasn't mad because Lazarus was dead. He's the one who let him die. He could have kept that from happening. So that can't be why Jesus was mad. He said there was a greater purpose than that. Was he mad at Mary saying, "Hey, Jesus, we wish you'd been here"? Mary said basically the exact same thing that Martha did. And Jesus wasn't angry with Martha when she said it, so why would he be angry with Mary when she said it? So what's different about this situation that may have made Jesus very upset? You got to understand a little background. You see, back in the day when this was going on, the expectation of the religious leaders was that Jewish families who experienced the death of a loved one would hire people to play flutes and to mourn. Basically, they were paid actors whose job it was to create emotional distress for everybody that this family was with, and to keep this family in this feeling that there was no hope. Add to this the somewhat derogatory statement about Jesus' ability to perform great miracles. I think these other translations got it clear. I think they got it right. So why do some translations not talk about Jesus being angry? Maybe they're not happy or comfortable with an angry Jesus. You see, when they construct their narrative of how they want to portray Jesus, because again, they're taking the original language and they have to choose which English words they want to use to describe the original language, maybe they're just not comfortable with the idea that Jesus was angry when his friend died. We think about Jesus' anger. We don't have any problem with him being angry when he clears the temple of all the money changers. We expect that. But for him to feel anger at the death of his friend? I know some of you are probably uncomfortable with me saying that about the translations and that, but you know what? All that means is we've got to study Scripture, my friends. And we need to look at different translations and make sure that we're getting the right version, the right picture of what. There is no perfect translation of Scripture, okay? But we have to do is we have to understand as best we can what is the story, what's the narrative that God really wants us to understand about Jesus. And when Paul wrote the letter to the church in Thessalonica, at the end of it, he says, I don't want you to grieve like the rest of men, who have no hope. I think that's why Jesus was so upset. Many scholars believe, and I believe too, that Jesus was so upset with the religious system of the day. We know that. He was always on the Pharisees' hind ends. And in this particular interaction, these people were required to feel like they had no hope. The fact Jesus had done what he had done, and there were still people who said they believed in him, but they didn't act like it, that I think made Jesus mad. So what was his plan? Show God's glory. He was going to call a dead man out of a grave that was blocked by a big rock, came out of a tomb, and that's exactly what happened. Lazarus walked out of that tomb to the glory of God. You see, in this instance, not only did these people get to see the glory of God, they got to see a preview, did they not? They got to see the preview of exactly what was going to happen to Jesus just a few weeks later. Here's how I want to wrap up this morning. I want to draw two connections to our lives from these two stories from Jesus' life. The first one is this. When we see God's glory in our lives, can we just realize that God is with us? But can we also find encouragement in knowing that he's with us? It's one thing to feel, this is great. But to actually look for encouragement like Jesus experienced when Elijah and Moses came and talked to Jesus, that was an encouragement to our Lord. We need to realize when God shows up in our lives, that's encouragement. It came at a very critical time in Jesus' life for him to hear an audible voice, just like he did at his baptism. I think glory always provides reassurance. Don't be afraid if God reveals himself to you in a glorious way. Just accept it as encouragement. Can you think about how agonizing it was for Jesus when he was dying on the cross to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And there was no voice. There was no cloud. There was no light. There was only silence. Can you imagine how terrifying that would have been? But But how reassuring it was when he heard it, and he felt it, and he saw it on the mountain. Sometimes we cry out to God, do we not? God, why have you forsaken me? Why is all of this happening in my life? I don't understand. And maybe we don't hear a voice. But I think if we look, we will see God's glory. And when we see God's glory, what does that mean? That means that God has not forsaken us. He has not left us, that he is still with us. You see, the Bible promises us God will not forsake us. Allow his glory to encourage you that that's true. The second point that I would make this morning is that we cannot get caught up in religious activities that do not create hope. You see, when we see God's glory, what we need to do is to allow it to create a longing for greater days of glory in the future. I said it the first week, I said it the second week, I'll say it this week. Our greatest glory days are not in the past. Our greatest glory days are in the future. And we have to remember that. Jesus performed miracles while he was here on earth, and one of them included the raising of his friend Lazarus from the dead. That was just a preview, my friends, for them and for us, of the glory days that are awaiting us some point in the future. When we see God's glory, may it create in us just a longing that this life and all of its goodness is going to be replaced and just be surrounded one day. We're going to be surrounded by God in all of his glory. And it's going to be so much better. But between now and then, there's a word that we need to do, and that is abide. We need to abide in him. As we abide, we will begin to piece together all of this little information about God's plan for our lives. And you know what? That narrative construction in our lives will be filled with glory. Let's sing about abiding.